Welcome to Your First Home Buyer Guide, the podcast for first home buyers who want to get it right.
I'm Megan and that was Veronica. We're both buyer's agents and probably old enough to be your mums. But that's a good thing because between us we've got over 40 years experience and we are going to share with you bucket loads of stories about avoidable mistakes. Together we're going to make sure that you get unbiased and real information that you can rely on so you can get where you want to be without missing a step.
Now, we've got loads of great tips for you in this episode, and if you'd like more useful tools, head over to the website homebuyeracademy.com.au. There you'll find free checklists that you can download, a free mini course on how to price a property, and our Where to Buy workshop for only $39. Priceless stuff, really.
Bargain. But before we get into the interesting stuff in this week's episode, here's the boring bit, the disclaimer. You of course know that nothing in this podcast is to be taken as personal advice. We always recommend getting the advice of an expert in their field of expertise. Now, we've done our very best to ensure that the content is correct at the time of recording, but things change. So check with the relevant government authority or your advisors to get the most up-to-date information.
In this episode, we're doing a regional spotlight, focusing on the things that first home buyers need to know about buying in Geelong and Ballarat. Local knowledge is so important when buying property, and today we're talking to a local expert who is going to share her tips on what first home buyers should be looking at and the mistakes that can be avoided in these areas.
Our guest buyer's agent is Cate Bakos of Cate Bakos Property, based in the inner West Melbourne suburb of Yarraville. Cate has been buying for clients in Geelong and Ballarat for over a decade now, but actually has been a buyer's agent in Melbourne for a lot longer than that. Thanks for joining us, Cate.
It's a total pleasure. Thanks for having me on the show.
Now, market's a bit crazy, isn't it, across the country? And we don't really want this to be about what the market's doing right this minute, because we want this to be evergreen and all about really what the local, the underlying stuff, I guess, in these areas. But I guess you can tell us the difference now, I guess. The differences in regional markets to a booming market to a quiet market as well. Over 10 years, I would expect you would have seen those changes. And first home buyers do need to understand that it's not always like it is now, right?
Not always at all. In fact, this is probably the headiest I think these markets have experienced themselves in forever. And I've known agents for the 10 years that I've been canvassing both of those cities, and they're saying the same thing. It's really hard to keep up with it all.
Yeah. So what are first home buyers actually buying at the moment in Geelong and Ballarat? What are you seeing them buy? And we're going to ask you a follow-up question to this afterwards. But what are they actually buying?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about them as separate cities because the products are quite different and the reasons why people are moving to each city are a little bit different. But if we talk about Ballarat to kick things off, and Ballarat's about a 70 to 80 minute train trip from the city, depending on which service you get on. And I can jump in the car and jet to Ballarat in about an hour and 15 minutes from Yarraville. So it's definitely...
Is that because you speed?
No.
Just checking. Is that normal?
Yeah. If there's no roadworks, and the Western Highway is a bit of a pain in the neck for roadworks at the moment, but that's also an indication of infrastructure upgrades because people are using the road a lot. Now, people can commute to the city and live in Ballarat. But ideally, you wouldn't want to do the daily grind. And COVID has changed that. Work from home has meant that lots of people have said, hey, let's do Ballarat because now we're getting away with, having a hybrid arrangement. So Ballarat people are looking generally for houses. First home buyers aren't really looking for units because they can afford a house and it's not too hard to get into town if you're in one of the outskirts suburbs. It's no more than a 12-minute drive into Ballarat CBD from any of the multiple. There's more than 20 suburbs in Ballarat. And if you're in the fringe areas and you're getting, a newish property, which is not my my preferred pick, but house and land, there's something for everyone.
Is that what you're seeing first home buyers buy? Now I'm not saying is that what you're recommending? That's the next question.
Yeah.
But is that what you're seeing people sort of gravitating towards because there's incentives there that are encouraging them to look at new?
Yeah, a bit of both. In Ballarat, if you want to be close to town and be able to walk into Sturt Street and walk to the local bars, etc., you won't be buying new. You'll have to get something established. But if you do want brand new and you're happy to jump in your car and be 10 minutes out of town, then there are quite a few estates that you can choose from. And yes, the incentives are quite compelling for a lot of people who haven't saved a traditional deposit.
So for those who have saved a traditional deposit, and I know I just said earlier we want this to be evergreen, but what's the price difference roughly? It'll give us an idea of the percentage difference.
Between old and new?
Yeah, or closer into town versus further out.
Yeah, of course. So if you're buying, let's say, a 3-bedroom house on a normal size block, so anything up to 600-700 square metres of land, you'll need about $400,000 for an entry-level, non-compromised, established property. Now, it might need renovating, particularly if it's in a really amazing spot. But if you're looking at entry level, you really need a minimum of $400,000. Mm-hmm. Once you're dipping below that, you're going into more compromised locations or main roads or things that I wouldn't get excited about as a buyer's agent. Mm. And if you're wanting to be in the really exciting suburbs that half of Melbourne talk about when they're dreaming of Ballarat, they're the suburbs like Ballarat Central and Soldiers Hill and Newington. They're really beautiful suburbs and they've got that lovely inner city sort of feel. It's a provincial city, so we've got some stunning architecture in Ballarat. If you're wanting a house in those suburbs, you'll need a minimum of $550,000, but you could easily spend up to $1 million in these suburbs and the locals wouldn't really bat an eyelid. So they are quite tightly held areas.
Okay, and they're you said it's provincial sort of area. So is there a lot of the character style houses that you see in inner Melbourne? Is that what you're looking at out there?
So. Yeah, if you go to Soldiers Hill, you'll see a little bit of a Fitzroy style architecture, beautiful red brick, tuck pointed hawthorn brick terraces lining some of the streets, and then you'll get some really amazing mansion style properties around the lake. The architecture is beautiful and it's a rich history, but mostly Victorian era in that area.
Interesting. And what are the employment opportunities for first home buyers? So if for example, someone was looking at relocating from Melbourne and they're seeing better value for money and better buying opportunities in Ballarat, what sort of work would they do?
Anyone who's in the health services or education industry will do quite well, but we've also got a lot of government jobs going in Ballarat and lots have been created. So one of the most significant...
Is that a decentralisation of the state government into Ballarat? Okay.
Very much so. So I'd name a few. We've got the ATO, we've got emergency services, 000, Vic Roads. So there are quite a few opportunities there that are located south of the city in an area called Tech Park. And then more recently in Mayor Street, so right in the heart of the city, we've got an enormous building called Gov Hub, and they're relocating a lot of people from consumer affairs in the Melbourne office up to Ballarat and incentivising them. So I've assisted some employees who have chosen to move to Ballarat and they work for consumer affairs.
How interesting. Okay,
Is there a shortage of... Sorry, go on.
Yeah, I remember a number of years ago, probably about 25, maybe 30 years ago, when Queensland went through a similar type of process to try and decentralise a lot of their Queensland government departments to hubs like Chermside and so forth, and it sort of didn't stick. A lot of those have gone back into the city. So interesting to see, long term if that continues to be an employment hub for Victorian government.
Yeah, we've seen it for quite a while. So this is just one more layer, and I haven't seen any wobbles in terms of the employment opportunities on offer from a decentralisation point of view. In fact, I've only seen them increase in the last 5 years.
Oh, interesting.
So has there been a shortage of property there? If there's a lot of people relocating for these jobs that are being created, has that led to a shortage, or is it all the new stock sort of being built to accommodate that growth?
A little bit of both. And as I'm sure you've talked to your viewers before, brand new in an area where there's a lot more brand new coming online, that can really perform slowly in the capital growth stakes. And we're seeing a little bit of that. Your issue is that you've got a high rate of depreciation for the building component. And obviously, even if the land is appreciating, it's not keeping up with the rate of depreciation. So that's one threat. But also, a lot of people are saying, well, I don't want a cookie cut brand new thing. I'd like to have a characterful street and be closer to the main street and the heart of Ballarat. So there's not enough established property, and there is a pretty steady supply of house and land, that's for sure. And the way that the city is expanding is both south and west and a little bit in the north. So there's a lot of land release options to choose from. They do tend to sell pretty quickly, but that is something that I obviously don't choose to buy. But as far as established property goes, there's a stock shortage, and locals have sat on their hands through COVID too. They didn't want people through their houses. They didn't want to do anything. So the supply and demand imbalance is pretty horrible.
Okay. We do talk a little bit with the podcast about rent vesting. So is it an option for people to look at Ballarat as a rent vesting opportunity?
It's an interesting question. Ballarat recently has had increased buyer demand from local first-time buyers. And the reason for that is they're saying to themselves, why would I rent in Ballarat and pay a 4% yield on someone else's asset? Mm-hmm. And then I can just buy my own and pay 2.5%. So rent vesting isn't as viable in Ballarat because it's actually cheaper.
The demand's not there?
Well, it's cheaper to buy a home and live in it than to you could certainly rent vest if you're a city slicker and you wanted to get a property that was a house on its own full block and you were cash strapped a little bit or restricted with your budget, because you won't get a $400,000 house in Melbourne, but you can in Ballarat. So I do see some rent vesters, but the most recent demand hasn't been investor demand. It's actually been local renters saying, well, if I can save a little bit of a deposit, I can get out of the rental trap.
How interesting.
It is interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that is an important thing about rent vesting. It depends where you want to live. And if you want to live in an expensive place, then it makes sense. But if if you are living in a more affordable place, you can see, you've just explained perfectly why it doesn't necessarily make sense.
Yeah. Excellent. Let's talk about Geelong.
I love Geelong.
So it's out the same direction, isn't it? Still, it's going west from the CBD.
Yes, that's right. So you're rolling around Port Phillip Bay's coast, and Geelong is less than an hour from Yarraville. It's about an hour from the city. On a fast train, you'll do it in just under an hour. And there's a few stations. In Ballarat, you've got your 2 train stations. In Geelong, you come into Corio, Norlane, North Shore, North Geelong, and then Geelong City, South Geelong, and then out to the more southern suburbs. So you've got good commuting options. The only catch with Geelong is everyone's pounced onto it. Lots of people can commute and do commute, but your chances of getting a seat on a train is pretty minuscule.
Oh, standing on a packed COVID train.
It's not fun. Yeah.
So for an hour.
For an hour. They need more services, and they've put on more services, but I don't think that they'll keep up with the demand, particularly when things normalise a little bit out of COVID. So during COVID, yes, you could get a seat on the train if you wanted to catch the train. But
if you were up for it.
Yeah. So it's an interesting one. A lot of people, when they're choosing a property in Geelong now, might be inclined, if they're commuters, to think about living south so that they can be first on the train.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
How interesting is that? So you actually start making, not only are you looking at transport options, but you're actually looking at how far down the line you are.
Yeah. Where can you live where you'd be guaranteed a seat? Because you can, tether and do some work on your laptop. You're sitting on a V-line train. It's a comfy train. It's not like the metro trains.
Right.
And that's a bit of a local tip, isn't it? Because, we're not
so
local from that area. We wouldn't know, but you do.
And there is the value of someone who knows intimately local aspects of a different area, because I would look at that and say, well, wouldn't it be better to be closer to Melbourne?
Yes.
As an outsider, I would be thinking, the closer I am to Melbourne, the better the opportunity. But as you say, I can't get a seat for my bottom.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Can be comfortable.
Yeah.
No, that's not comfortable at all.
There's also water in Geelong, of course, because it's on the bay, and then a little bit further south you've got beaches, and so there's other reasons I would imagine, or other draw cards there that say Ballarat wouldn't have.
Yeah.
Is that a big part of it, do you think?
Huge part, yeah. Now, the Port of Corio, which is the bay that Geelong looks onto, has always had that industrial vibe. And anyone who knows Geelong, they'll picture the refinery on the on the
car manufacturing as well, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was.
Ford left a few years back, yeah.
Yes, and Geelong's a really interesting one. A lot of people were very, very nervous about Geelong when Ford was closing, and that's because, employment was really shattered there for a huge sector, and Geelong did bounce back, but it had a bit of a little bit of a renaissance, because it's really evolved from an industrial city to now a pretty trendy extension and an option outside of Melbourne. And I look at it like you Sydney-siders look at Wollongong and Newcastle, and they've experienced growth for lots of reasons. Housing affordability in Sydney is one of them. And we're facing the same sort of issue in Melbourne, but Geelong has beautiful beaches. It's changing very quickly. It's got a great waterfront precinct right across from the city. We've got a university campus now right on the beach, and also in Warn Ponds. And again, like Ballarat, Geelong's had a lot of jobs created. So they've been beautifying it, they've been funding it, and there's lots to do. I went to Geelong recently with friends, and one of the laneways that was always facing multi-storey car parks and wasn't particularly sexy is now just full of all these bars. And it's amazing. It's got a really cool vibe.
Love a good foodie laneway.
Oh, yeah. And we know Melbourne's famous for it, so that's just an extension. I think what's interesting too, I talk to people a lot about gentrification, and I guess that's what you're talking about. You're talking about the moving from that more working class and the origins
industrial
and into more of a sort of a middle class white collar type of environment. And of course, when you've got white collar workers working in a place and living in a place, then prices start to go up because wages tend to be higher. I mean, it's just the typical sort of way things go. And the gentrification piece is all around also having some lovely period homes and period buildings, which I know there are down there in Geelong. Maybe slightly older. They're more Edwardian, aren't they, than Victorian? Would that be right?
You've got a few Victorians, but you've also got a lot of Federation and Californian bungalow. And then you've got your mid-century around the Barwon River. So Belmont's got some really beautiful mid-century homes as well.
Yeah, and so when you got those period homes that then start to be renovated, and then you start to see the bars and the cafes, they're the sorts of hallmarks of, okay, it's not just we're not talking about gentrification here. This is actually happening.
Yes.
It's happened. And potentially the growth is, that big uptake on growth has already been taken out or factored into prices. So I would imagine there's no this is not on the horizon. It's now, people paying for it now. But how do the prices compare, say, for an equivalent home? If you're going to be walking distance, say, to Geelong's, laneway bars, what's the difference? What's the pricing differential between that and, say, a Melbourne equivalent?
Oh, wow. Half price in Geelong. Definitely half price, maybe even more. So I recently missed out on a property in South Geelong, and it was a beautiful period house. It had a rear lane and a double car garage, and that sold in the early 900,000s. If I was to get something like that is conveniently located to our city, you'd be looking at least $2.5 million. I'm thinking something like Fitzroy North or West Garth and Northcote. You'd be absolutely on the hook for over 2.5 to get that product on that land, walking distance to all of those things.
Okay, interesting. So there's still a real element of affordability there for Geelong if you're willing to do the commute, or if the employment opportunity is right for you. So
if you're in a role where you've got that flexibility. I've recently had a family that could be described professionally as two very successful people in their own right, with young children who transitioned here from the inner ring suburbs, from a gorgeous house that they'd extended. They moved to Newtown in Geelong and bought a period house there. And their drivers were multiple drivers, but really good schools. So Geelong is renowned for its great private schools.
Right.
And they've got their girls into a really great school.
Interesting.
So there is a lot of, all regional towns have these sort of development or new subdivisions going on. There's been, I think, state governments around the country have been incentivising regions to, release house and land packages, and there's no shortage of them in Geelong and the surrounding areas. What's the story? Where are first home buyers gravitating?
Yeah, if a first home buyer is capped at in Victoria, if you purchase up to 600,000 and you qualify for the stamp duty concession, you'll pay no stamp duty. So it's free up to 600, and then it tapers off between 600 and 750. So if you're wanting to stick to your 600 budget, you'll have to get your skates on and get moving, because it is going, it is definitely trending upwards. But Grovedale, which again gets you an early seat on the train, Grovedale is in the south, and it's all very 70s, 80s, 90s brick veneer houses. It's a bit Pleasantville, but you've got easy options to get into the city. You've got good buses, and you've got major shopping centres as well. So Grovedale's one area where they're heading. If you're looking at gentrifying areas, places to the east like Newcombe, they've had their stigma, and they're kind of shaking that stigma now. But Newcombe is next to East Geelong, so you're pretty close to the heart of everything. And if you're okay with a townhouse or a villa unit, you could pretty much buy into any of the suburbs that are touching Geelong Central postcode 3220. You could get a villa unit within your first home buyer spend. If you're willing to press the budget a little bit and forget about the stamp duty concession and spend circa 800, you could get a character home, a period home.
And we talk about those artificial price barriers that are being created by some of these incentives and discounts and concessions. And that's a really good point that you make, Kate, because if you can move from a townhouse, as you said, a townhouse, sub 600, but a house circa 800, you might actually find that the upward pressure on prices in that sub 600 range are actually artificially inflated, because there's so many people trying to compete in the under 600 price range, as opposed to just sometimes we talk about maybe the 650 or the 700 might be better value or buying opportunities. Always
a risk with first home buyers. I remember when we first had this ridiculous incentive in Victoria, and all of the first home buyers were fighting each other to get to the 600 mark. Yes. And I was bidding on a townhouse in Kensington, I remember it, and my buyers were first home buyers, and I was really nervous. What if someone else said, don't worry, I've got it all worked out, and the opening bid was 600, and they all just disappeared.
They were all gone.
Boom, job done.
Now, I want to ask you, every city has its uniqueness and things that as a local, work and what doesn't work. And, we have a list of 36 investment criteria for Brisbane. I'm sure you have a very similar way of looking at things when you look at properties. Yeah. What are some of the mistakes that are specific to, and I guess we're going to treat them differently, but what are some of the mistakes that you see people make that is very specific to Geelong and Ballarat separately?
Picking the cheapest suburb because they read about it on a forum from someone who doesn't live there.
Oh, yes.
We all
love a bit of free advice, but what's that worth?
The best free advice you can get, if that's your strategy, is call a local property manager. Because property managers know the worst areas in both of these cities, and the good property managers won't take stock in them. Ooh. So if you've bought in such a vile area,
Kate,
that you can't get a good property manager, you've already bought a dud.
That is such gold information. It's so true. I was stalking a Facebook group last night, and somebody's posted, where's a good place to buy an investment property? And I've got in typically, of course, that if anyone
you didn't express your opinion, did you, Veronica?
I know.
I bite my tongue so hard I almost bite it off. I try not to take the bait with those, because then you get a bunch of people that have already followed bad advice. And
exactly.
And they're trying to get everybody to follow it as well. Yeah.
Well, there was all the opinions like, rents are up in this area and this and that and blah, blah, blah. And I just went, you know what? Nobody can actually answer that question for you. You need to do your own research. And then it was like, oh, what do you mean? And then and gave a bit more information. It was like, so what do you recommend then? I said, you missed the point. I was telling you, I can't tell you that answer any more than anybody else.
Nobody should tell you that.
But here's the link to our podcast episode about where to buy. And which means I'll probably be thrown off that Facebook page, but out of the group because it's not our group. But anyway, I try not to plug, but I can't help myself. But yeah, and people are giving that type of advice. You know, it's like the people that say, "Oh, buy under median." You know, go and buy under median. It's like, well. Generally, you're buying shit.
There's a reason that it's under median. It's usually got, as Kate mentioned, you know, one of those massive objections that you can't overcome, whether it's on a train line or floods or main road, or, you know, if you can't fix it, it's always going to be an issue. That's one of our Home Buyer Academy principles.
That is, and that's a great tip, though. I love that. Ask the property managers, would they take it on as a management? That's gold. What's another mistake you see? You know, it doesn't have to be first home buyers, because let's face it, all buyers make mistakes. Buyers of all, levels make mistakes. What's something else that's typical to these regions?
They're both regions that offer auctions, but you'll tend to find, especially in the first home buyer budgets, they're private sales. And these agents have all cottoned on to the crazy conditions. And instead of having back and forth transparent fights or Zoom auctions, they're saying give us your best and highest. So the one hit wonder. And that can be really problematic for someone who's lazy and not doing their homework. There's no excuses for not doing homework with the information that we have on hand. You don't have to go and pay for an advocate if you don't want to. You don't need to pay for a valuer. You need to get on the sold tab and have a look at what properties like yours are going for. Because if you panic and you get FOMO and you pay way too much for it, you might have a valuation issue. And if you are looking at the agent's quote range or not doing your homework, you'll just keep missing out. And these property markets at the moment feel like they're moving 1% per week. That's not sustainable, but right now that's the pace of the market. So if you're mucking around and not doing your homework and taking 12 weeks to get real about what the price actually needs to be for what you want, you're going to be looking at 12% worth of market movement potentially. So now is not the time to be tardy with homework.
More even, because it's compounding.
But it's so important to do the homework. You know, don't just get out there and throw a dart and hope that you actually land it. It is so vitally important to do the homework. And don't just go and get one of those automated valuations that you can get from a bank. Or on one of the portals that tells you, you know, this is our guesstimate of what it's worth. You know, do your homework, do your homework.
And we have something to help you there. We actually have a free course that teaches you how to actually do your homework and price a property. So I have to chuck the plug in, because let's face it, it's there for you. It's on the website. It's free. So it's on homebuyeracademy.com.au/free course.
I love it.
It is so important, and exactly what you're saying there, Kate. You've got to do your research, because I still can't get over the amount of people that I'll ask, you know, how have you worked out what price you're going to pay for that property? Oh, well, I'm just going to go in with my maximum. But is it worth your maximum? I don't know. I've given up because the market's so hot. It was like, whoa, that's how you end up overpaying.
It's really disheartening in a market like this for buyers, isn't it? And you've just got to stay tough but realistic. You know, we're working with a buyer at the moment, and they're just so unrealistic with what they should pay and determined to win. And remember, we had a student, Veronica, that he was like fighting a one-man war against the property market, and you've got to kind of take that hat off of, I have to get this at a great price. And if you want to buy a property at the moment, and we're in a really strong upwardly driven market with lack of supply and a huge amount of demand, you have to be very, very realistic about what you need to pay for a property.
And in fact, we are going to do a case study episode with that very buyer, that very student, he and his wife, because they did buy.
They did
buy.
And
they actually bought in the Geelong area. So keep tuned, because in coming weeks, that case study is coming, and we are so proud of them.
It's like being like a proud mother looking at the achievements of your star students, and
that's it.
They call themselves property bears. They said the two biggest property bears in Australia have just purchased, so we're very happy for them.
We're in a hot market. That was the other thing too. Can't believe it. Two property bears purchased in a hot market, they did it very, very carefully, and we're so proud. Have you seen anything? I mean, the market is a bit crazy at the moment, but just as a final note, Kate, have you seen anything crazy that you'd love to share with us?
I see lots of crazy right now. In terms of buyers stretching, I was just talking this morning on our little podcast about a situation. I had an auction here in Melbourne that I was warming up for this Saturday. And I thought it's probably worth $1,050,000, but it might hit 1.1 with the level of interest that we've got. Anyway, I got an SMS from the agent yesterday saying, acceptable offer, let us know by 5 p.m. if you're in, 1.22. So I thought, he's missing a zero. I'll just double check.
No.
I said, what's the story? And he said, first home buyer sick of missing out.
Wow. So we're talking, 15% over.
At least 10.
Let's hope the valuation stacks up.
Absolutely. Or bank of mum and dad.
Yes.
That's hard.
So it is tough out there. There's no doubt
really
about
tough.
it.
Yeah, I'm not enjoying this market at all. Nobody is. It's really difficult to navigate, and you put a lot of effort into your due diligence and your prep to get smashed. And what I'm noticing is it's not necessarily other advocates that are pipping us.
No. We've got the same thing.
First home buyers. So we've seen all of this COVID saving, and bear in mind, for anyone tackling Geelong and Ballarat, chances are a fair proportion of them will be coming from Melbourne. Now, Melburnians were in lockdown for 3 months. And in that 3-month period, aside from putting on weight, we saved a lot of money. And for first home buyers, when you save money, it translates into a larger pool of borrowing capacity. So we're seeing that unfolding, particularly in Melbourne, because we had forced savings for a longer period.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Okay. And I guess that whole FOMO, that whole fear of missing out, rapidly rising, probably have a go at a couple of auctions, maybe paid for a couple of building and pest inspections, and then just throw their hands in the air and say whatever it takes.
Yep. And that's not the way to go. But yes, we're seeing a lot of that.
Be careful, be cautious, be realistic. Some really great tips in there, Kate.
Been a great chat. It
has been a great chat. So, I mean, in summary, we wanted to give an overview of what options are out there in Geelong and Ballarat, why people might go there, and some of the things to be aware of. And so thank you so much for sharing that with us. We also are very mindful that the temptation is just to either throw your hands up and give up or go all in. And one of the reasons, and I'm finding the same thing in Sydney, and I'm sure you find the same thing in Brisbane, Megan, is that we aren't necessarily going head to head with buyer's agents, because buyer's agents are smart enough to know that some property is worth pushing yourself for, but not all property. And if we're going to throw our hands up in the air, it's going to be for something absolute cracker, not just for anything. And I think that's what we're seeing. And I was discussing with my team today that the stuff that's selling really fast in Sydney, like super fast, is the highly compromised properties that those agents know that somebody with FOMO has made a huge offer, and they're not even going to wait to see if they can get more buyers. Just going to smack it out the door. So,
they're hard to sell. They're usually hard to sell.
That's exactly right. And they know that. Yes. Anyway, thanks for joining us, Kate.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
In this episode, we've covered a very small part of our 10-step online course for first home buyers. If you would like to learn more about the process and how to buy without making a mistake, then head over to our website, www.homebuyeracademy.com.au. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you won't miss an episode. And if you like what you've heard today, please give us an iTunes review. 5 stars would be wonderful. It will help others find us as well.
Thank you for joining us. We hope you found this really useful. And if you have, please share the love with others who you know are in the same boat. We'll be back next week with some more priceless stuff.